One of the cool things about getting older is when you realize that you've just lived through a cultural shift. In gaming, we're lucky to have these happen almost every console generation when trends come and go. But one aspect of gaming that took about 20 years to change was adaptations and our perception of them. For the longest time, when you heard that your favorite game was being made into a movie, your day was ruined. It seemed like we'd never get away from video game movies being made by people who didn't even play the games they were adapting. But if you look at the landscape today, things are quite different. The curse was broken, and we have amazing adaptations like Arcane, Fallout, The Last of Us, and Sonic the Hedgehog at the forefront of entertainment. So, what changed? How did good video game adaptations become the norm, and how did bad adaptations become outliers? If you say it's because adaptations today are better written, that's certainly true and worth talking about. But I think there's an additional, equally interesting factor at play here that's been rumbling for the last 2 or 3 decades. Today, I want to talk about something that few people touch on, and that's how changes in our culture are responsible for the increased quality and appeal of modern adaptations. This is why video game adaptations are great now. You may ask how we're in a golden age of video game adaptations when there's still stuff like Borderlands coming out. But Borderlands is actually a perfect candidate for a thought experiment I'd like to run. Back in 2019, I did a video talking about why most video game adaptations were terrible, and my argument boiled down to awful talent will inevitably produce awful films. For a long time, it was common to blame the entire medium of video games for bad adaptations, instead of blaming the people making them. Thankfully, I think we've moved past that, and as a test, here's the question I'd like to ask you. Is Borderlands a bad film because the source material is the problem, or is it a bad film because its director and writer, Eli Roth, hasn't made a good movie since 2007? If your inclination is to blame the filmmaker, you're not only correct, you've just demonstrated a modern way of thinking about this subject. For over a decade, mediocre filmmakers were able to get away with putting out garbage because everyone believed that games were unadaptable. The attitude towards adaptations was not serious because most studio heads and filmmakers did not take games seriously. Back then, games were an emerging medium that Hollywood was forced to acknowledge because of their growing cultural significance. But games weren't something that most of those people interacted with or understood. So anytime a game was adapted, the conventional wisdom was to change the things that Hollywood didn't understand to try to make it more appealing to audiences of the time. Clearly, that didn't work. Many of these adaptations relied on cheap iconography and completely butchered what people loved about the games. What also didn't help is that game publishers were happy to give out film rights to almost anyone. And because game movies were seen as cheap projects, they attracted cheap talent. I'm sure we could have gotten a great video game movie in the mid-2000s if studios had reached out to more experienced filmmakers, but they probably did and couldn't convince them because the space was full of movies like Blood Rain and Doom. This was all a recipe for disaster, and if this is the way you're making films, you're going to fail. Borderlands reeks of that antiquated mindset, and the reason it sticks out so much today is because it's surrounded by works that were made by a completely different generation of creatives. This is that cultural shift I mentioned. Video game movies of old were clearly made by people who either didn't grow up with games or weren't fans of them. They may have played a bit of the games they were making a movie on, but by and large, games were a foreign concept to most of them. Those filmmakers didn't get consoles for Christmas, and they didn't go to school and talk to their friends about games because they simply weren't in the culture the way the kids and teens who were the target audience for their films were. And none of that meant that they couldn't have made a good movie. It just meant that they weren't in the best position to understand the source material. And that, alongside their own talent and whatever nonsense the studio wanted, is what gave us such poor movies. Almost all of that has changed today. Those kids that grew up with games are the filmmakers and other creatives now. Game publishers are also a lot more selective to who they give film or TV rights to, because bad adaptations reflect poorly on the intellectual property itself. A great example is Fallout. Todd Howard had been approached multiple times to adapt Fallout, but it wasn't until he spoke to Jonathan Nolan that he was convinced. And that's not a surprise. Jonathan Nolan is a longtime Fallout player and an incredibly talented writer-director that actually understands video games. Now, just being a fan is not a guarantee of quality, but when the person asking to be an executive producer on an adaptation of your games is both a fan of your games and has a resume like Jonathan Nolan's, it's easy to see how Todd Howard was convinced that Fallout would be in good hands. Another interesting example of a different approach to modern video game adaptations is Arcane. Arcane was the result of Riot Games wanting to expand the League of Legends IP into other media. They were interested in exploring the possibility of an animated series using their characters that was aimed at adults. So they repartnered with Studio Fortiche, who they'd already worked together with for music videos, and took 6 years to create the first season of Arcane. Now in 2025, Arcane is one of the best things ever produced by the French, and Riot Games owns a significant non-controlling stake in Fortiche, presumably so they can continue making animated projects in service of their original IP. This level of autonomy and proactiveness from a publisher regarding portrayals in other media of their own intellectual property would have been unheard of 15 years ago and is one of the main factors behind Arcane's quality. Something that isn't talked about enough is how adaptations have gotten better the more that games have aligned with film. And that doesn't just mean games becoming more cinematic in their presentation. It also has to do with some skill sets required for the games industry today being similar to those required in films due to cross-pollination of tools and software. This has made it so that developers can better understand how to make their own supplemental media and potential adaptations without having to depend entirely on outside studios. With that said, something like The Last of Us obviously benefited from its source material being so filmic. But even that is a great example of a modern mindset being applied to an adaptation because Neil Druckmann co-wrote some of its episodes and was also heavily involved in the show's production. So what about modern adaptations still made through the traditional movie studio system? That brings us to Sonic. Not this Sonic, that Sonic. While the Sonic the Hedgehog film was obviously made by passionate people, that's not something that really came across in that film's first trailer like it did in the actual film. It had a horrible choice for music, and of course, it featured the infamous Ugly Sonic. If this movie had released like this, we would have pointed to it as an example of Hollywood not understanding games again, despite it not being a terrible film. But that didn't happen. The feedback from fans was heard and addressed. This is also not something that ever happened in the past. People who complained about these things were usually seen as nerds in their mother's basement who couldn't possibly know what was best for a movie. That's a mindset that some filmmakers still exhibit today. But now we're in an age where voices are heard, and while it can be difficult to extract genuine criticism from those voices, it usually results in a work that makes more people happy and therefore makes more money. Quality sells, and though that can sometimes lead to exploitation of fan service, as a whole, I think this mindset has benefited game adaptations because there are just higher standards now than there were before. Beyond the creatives behind these new adaptations inherently understanding their source material better, both publishers and developers have finally learned how to take care of their intellectual property. That doesn't mean there will never be bad adaptations again, but the likelihood of them goes down with each consecutive successful work because others will be eager to copy a recipe for success. And as bad adaptations flop, good adaptations will also get more seasons. This is how good art proliferates and takes over the market. There's also a lot to be learned from failure, and I think all those awful adaptations from the 2000s were necessary for talent and executives alike to learn how to avoid them. On the press tour for Fallout, Jonathan Nolan said that game adaptations are difficult because you're robbing viewers of the interactivity they had while playing the game. You're taking a large aspect of the property away and must replace it with something else. Now I'd like to discuss how contemporary creatives were able to give us that elusive something else in their adaptations while staying faithful to everything we loved about a game. Those old adaptations were all horrible for one simple reason. In their attempt to fill the void left by gameplay, they failed to create compelling narratives that stayed true to their source material. We're keenly aware of bad writing in adaptations because we already know the potential of the characters and setting. Games get adapted because they're popular, and while gameplay is typically the driving force behind that popularity, we also tend to love a game's world and characters. What modern adaptations have nailed is putting a game's characters, or original characters from that universe, in stories we actually want to see. And the reason that has been so important is because adaptations can do something that games can't. They can make you care about an intellectual property that you would never play the games of. I have no interest in League of Legends, but I think Arcane is fascinating because of how its characters are woven through a story about parenthood, rebellion, and self-discovery. Great films and series capture you when you have genuine interest in their characters and want to see what happens to them next. And what modern adaptations have been able to do is sidestep the largest barrier of entry for some games, which is their gameplay. We see adaptations differently today because they're no longer just bringing your favorite games to life. They also offer quality entertainment without having to engage with the original game. When Cyberpunk Edgerunners came out, it was during a time when a lot of people were still on the fence about Cyberpunk 2077 after the game's launch. But Edgerunners didn't require you to play the game. It gave you the game's aesthetic, sound, and action through an original story in the same universe, and it worked. Where game adaptations used to only serve as fans of that specific franchise, they now have much broader appeal because their writing has proven itself to be capable of telling high-quality stories in general. And this is why the approach to the Halo television series was so baffling to me. To those who haven't seen it, the writer said they didn't look at the games for the basis of the series, only the overall lore, but then proceeded to make a completely different timeline where almost none of that story is the same. By changing the IP to the point where it was unrecognizable, they immediately alienated longtime fans and even people who hadn't played Halo, because what they may have seen of the games just wasn't present in the series. The same thing happened with the new Tomb Raider show, where the showrunner said that a story about classic Lara Croft simply wasn't interesting to them, and the show features a Lara who isn't like any of her previous incarnations. While we've gone over how publishers have gotten more selective with who they allow to make their adaptations, if they want adaptations to stay great, then people who show disinterest or disdain for a game should probably be kept away from creative roles. None of this is to say you can't deviate from source material. The problem is when you deviate heavily and the story you come up with is bad on top of that. I know that the Castlevania series strays quite a bit from its source material, but its action and the dynamic between Alucard, Trevor, and Sypha carries it through its first 2 seasons and kept me watching past that. For all the reasons we've just talked about, I believe that video game adaptations have entered a golden age. but it's even better than I'm making it sound. I think game adaptations are where comic book films were back in the mid to late 2000s when we had Sin City, V for Vendetta, Iron Man, and The Dark Knight. You could see that after a long string of bad comic book movies, Hollywood was finally starting to get it. And that's where game adaptations are now. We're finally seeing the results of passionate and talented creatives who have been influenced by the very medium they're adapting. I have no doubt that things will get better from here, given the insane amount of games just waiting to be adapted and how current adaptations have changed people's perspectives as to what they can offer. And yeah, every once in a while we'll still get a Borderlands or a Halo, but that's not too dissimilar to what happened during the rise of comic book movies when garbage like Fantastic Four released in a sea of exceedingly superior films. The future of adaptations is bright, and I'd love to know what you think would make a great movie or television series and who you'd want to make it. I think Guy Ritchie would have made a great classic Tomb Raider movie, and like many, I've always wanted an animated Overwatch series. Maybe someday. Until then, thanks for watching.